The wind howls through the rugged hills of Carnarvon, where a child's cry pierces the night in 1284. Edward, fourth son of a fearsome king, is born under the shadow of a crown he was never meant to wear. His father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, dreams of a warrior heir to forge an empire. Yet this boy, with his gentle hands and curious eyes, finds joy in the clink of a blacksmith's hammer, not the clash of swords. What does it mean to be destined for a throne that feels like a cage? In the stone halls of Westminster, young Edward learns the weight of his father's gaze. The king's voice thunders, demanding a prince who embodies chivalry and conquest. Edward, however, wanders the fields, digging ditches alongside peasants, his laughter mingling with theirs. Chronicles whisper of a boy who prefers the company of craftsmen to knights, a scandal in a court obsessed with honor. How can a prince carve his own path when the world demands he mirror a titan? At 16, Edward meets Piers Gaveston, a Gascon noble with a sharp wit and fearless charm. Their bond sparks like flint on steel, a friendship that feels like freedom in a life of duty. To Edward, Gaveston is a mirror of his own heart, unburdened by the crown's expectations. His father, enraged by their closeness, tears handfuls of hair from his son's scalp, banishing Gaveston to teach Edward a lesson. What is the cost of loyalty when it defies a king's command? The year 1307 brings death and a crown to a trembling 23-year-old. Edward I's passing leaves the throne to a son who never wanted it. Edward II's first act is to recall Gaveston, granting him titles and treasures that shock the nobility. The coronation glitters with gold, but whispers of scandal drown out the cheers. Gaveston carries the sacred crown, a privilege reserved for royalty. Can a king rule with his heart when his court demands his soul? Isabella of France, a 12-year-old princess, arrives in 1308 to wed a king who barely sees her. Edward's eyes are fixed on Gaveston, his laughter reserved for his friend, not his bride. The jewels meant for Isabella end up in Gaveston's hands, a slight that burns in her young heart. The nobility, led by the king's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, see that this outsider's influence. How does a queen endure a marriage that feels like a public humiliation? The baron's patience snaps, demanding Gaveston's exile to restore order. Edward, torn between love and duty, sends his friend away, only to call him back months later. Each reunion fuels the nobles' rage, their swords itching for justice. In 1312, the barons capture Gaveston, dragging him to a roadside where steel meets flesh. What does it mean to lose the one person who made a king feel human? Edward's grief hardens into vengeance, but his throne trembles under the weight of his failures. The Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, crush his army at Bannockburn in 1314, a defeat that echoes his father's victories. The royal treasury dwindles, drained by a king who governs with passion, not precision. New favorites, like Hugh Despenser the Younger, rise to power, their greed alienating allies. How does a king lead when every choice seems to unravel his legacy? Isabella, now a woman, watches her husband's court spiral into chaos. The Despensers, father and son, wield power like a blade, crushing enemies and hoarding wealth. Her voice, once ignored, grows sharp with resentment, her heart cold toward a king who betrayed her. In 1325, sent to France on a diplomatic mission, she finds not just purpose, but a lover. Roger Mortimer, a banished baron with fire in his veins. What happens when a queen decides she will no longer be a pawn? The whispers of rebellion reach Edward, but he clings to the Despensers, blind to the storm gathering across the Channel. Isabella and Mortimer plot in France, their alliance a fusion of ambition and desire. Edward's allies dwindle, his court fractured by fear and distrust. In 1326, a small army lands on England's shores, led by a queen who was once his bride. How does a king face a betrayal that wears the face of his own wife? The end comes swiftly, like a blade in the dark. Edward flees westward, the Despensers at his side, but the people greet Isabella as a savior. Captured, the king watches as Hugh Despenser is torn apart, castrated, disemboweled, his screams a prelude to Edward's fate. In January 1327, Edward is forced to abdicate, his crown passed to his 14-year-old son, Edward III. What remains for a king who has lost everything but his breath? At Berkeley Castle, Edward's world shrinks to a cell's cold walls. His wrists bear the scars of chains, his body weakened by deliberate neglect. Guards mock him, forcing him to ride without pants, his skin raw from torment. Yet his spirit refuses to break, a flicker of defiance in a man who was never meant to be king. Why does resilience persist when hope is a fading ember? The night of September 21, 1327, looms like a shadow over history. Two men enter Edward's cell, their purpose cloaked in silence. The stories that follow, tales of a red-hot iron and muffled screams, will haunt the centuries. But what truth lies beneath the legend of a king's final moments? Will we ever know the price of a crown that demanded his soul? A scream echoes through Berkeley Castle, swallowed by the night of September 21, 1327. Edward II, once a king, lies in chains, his body a canvas of suffering. The air is thick with the stench of betrayal as two shadowy figures enter his cell. Legends speak of a red-hot iron, a cruel end, crafted to punish a king's heart. What does it mean to die in a way that history will never forget? The tale of Edward's death spreads like wildfire. Whispered in taverns and courts, chroniclers, decades later, pen the story of a horn tube and burning iron, a punishment for sins they dare not name. Some say it was propaganda, a tale spun to vilify his killers, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Others argue the method was symbolic, a grotesque mirror of the king's rumored desires. How does a story become truth when it serves the powerful? Edward's life, now a shadow, was once a tapestry of defiance and devotion. Born to rule, he chose to love, placing Piers Gaveston above the throne's demands. His heart, unguarded, invited envy and scorn from a nobility that craved control. Each choice, Gaveston's titles, the Despenser's rise, wove a noose that tightened with every passing year. Can a king's love be his greatest crime? Isabella, the queen who toppled a king, stands at the heart of this tragedy. Her youth was spent in Edward's shadow, her pride wounded by his neglect. In France she found Roger Mortimer, a man who matched her ambition and kindled her resolve. Their invasion in 1326 was not just a rebellion, but a reckoning for a queen scorned. What drives a woman to destroy the man she vowed to stand beside? The Despensers, architects of Edward's final years, paid a gruesome price for their greed. Hugh the Younger's execution, dragged, castrated, disemboweled, was a spectacle meant to sate a vengeful crowd. Edward, watching from his cell, knew his own fate was sealed. The crown, once a symbol of divine right, now mocked him in its absence. How does a man face the end when his enemies write his story? Berkeley Castle's walls hold secrets that history struggles to unravel. Some historians argue Edward was suffocated, a quieter death that left no marks. Others whisper of a stranger tale, that he never died at all. A letter, known as the Fieschi Letter, claims Edward escaped, his place taken by a porter's corpse. What if the king outlived his legend, a ghost in a world that buried him? The Fieschi Letter, delivered to Edward III in 1333, spins a tale of survival. An Italian cleric claims Edward wandered Europe, a hermit cloaked in anonymity. In 1338, a man named William the Welshman appeared, claiming to be the lost king. Most dismiss these stories as fantasy, yet some scholars pause, wondering if truth hides in the margins. How does a king's death become a riddle that defies time? Edward III, the boy who inherited a fractured throne, faced his father's ghost. In 1330, he seized power, executing Mortimer and imprisoning his mother, Isabella. The legend of the red-hot iron, some say, was his creation, a tool to demonize those who betrayed his father. By blaming guards like Thomas Gurney, he crafted a narrative of justice. What does a son owe a father whose crown he wears? The tomb in Gloucester Cathedral, carved in alabaster, shows a king at peace. Visitors even today stand before it, drawn to a story of triumph and tragedy. The body, embalmed in 1327, hides its secrets, its face unreadable. Was it Edward or a stranger laid to rest in his name? Why does a king's end matter more than the life he lived? Edward's reign, though flawed, reshaped the idea of kingship. His deposition, the first formal removal of an English monarch, challenged the divine right to rule. Nobles learned they could unmake a king, a precedent that would echo through centuries. His personal desires, once scandalous, now spark debates about identity and power. How does one man's heart redefine a nation's history? Theater, too, immortalized Edward's tale with Christopher Marlowe's play in the 1590s. On stage, the king is a tragic figure, torn between love and duty. The red-hot iron, though not described, lingers in productions, a symbol of cruelty's enduring grip. Audiences weep for a man who dared to be himself in a world that demanded a mask. What stories do we tell to make sense of a king's fall? As the centuries pass, Edward's life remains a mirror for our own struggles. His choices, love over duty, defiance over conformity, speak to the human heart. The legends, true or false, remind us that history is written by the victors. Yet in his alabaster tomb, Edward lies silent, his truth lost to time. What do we lose when we judge a man by his end, not his dreams? In the quiet of Gloucester Cathedral, an alabaster king gazes skyward, serene in death. Edward II's tomb, a monument to a man history cannot forget, draws pilgrims seeking answers. Was he the victim of a brutal murder, or did he slip through fate's grasp? 700 years later, his story still burns, a riddle wrapped in tragedy. What makes a king's life echo louder than his crown? The legend of the red-hot iron, born decades after Edward's supposed end, grips the imagination. Chroniclers like Geoffrey Le Baker painted a death so horrific it became myth. Some say it was a lie, crafted to shame Isabella and Mortimer, who ruled through Edward's son. Others see it as truth, a punishment for a king who loved too fiercely. How do we separate fact from the stories we need to believe? Edward's heart, once his strength, was his undoing in a world of iron and ambition. His bond with Piers Gaveston defied a court that valued power over loyalty. Later, the Despensers filled that void, their greed a mirror of Edward's own blind devotion. Each choice carved a path to Berkeley Castle, where history claims he fell. What does it mean to be true to yourself when the cost is everything? Isabella's shadow looms large, a queen who rewrote her fate. From a humiliated bride to a rebel leader, she wielded power with a ferocity Edward lacked. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer was both love and strategy, a spark that burned a kingdom. Yet her victory came at a price, her son's judgment and history's scorn. How does a woman balance vengeance with the legacy she leaves behind? Edward III, crowned at 14, inherited a throne stained by his father's blood. In 1330 he struck back, executing Mortimer and confining his mother. The tale of Edward II's death, some argue, was shaped by his son's need for justice. By vilifying the guards, he cleansed his reign of their shadow. What does it take to rule when your crown rests on a father's grave? The Fieschi Letter, a whisper from 1333, challenges everything we know. It claims Edward lived, a wanderer in Europe, his death a deception. A man called William the Welshman, appearing in 1338, swore he was the lost king. Most historians scoff, but the letter's details gnaw at certainty. What if history buried a man who refused to die? Marlowe's play, penned in the 1590s, gave Edward a new life on stage. The king, flawed and human, weeps for Gaveston and defies his fate. The red-hot iron, though unwritten, haunts performances, a symbol of a world that punishes difference. Audiences, then and now, see themselves in his struggle. Why do we return to stories that break our hearts? Edward's deposition shattered the myth of divine kingship. Nobles, emboldened, would unseat others, Richard II, Henry VI, following his precedent. His personal life, once a scandal, now fuels debates about identity and power. His tomb, a silent witness, invites us to question the stories we inherit. How does one man's fall redefine the thrones that follow? The clash between duty and desire, so vivid in Edward's life, speaks to us still. He loved fiercely, ruled poorly, and died or vanished in shadow. History judges him, but his choices linger, raw and human. We too wrestle with the masks we wear for the world. What does it mean to live authentically when society demands conformity? Today, visitors to Gloucester Cathedral pause before Edward's effigy, its calm face belying the chaos of his life. The tomb hides its secrets, as does the man it honors. Was he a victim, a survivor, or something in between? His story, like all great tragedies, leaves us with more questions than answers. What truths do we seek when we stand before the graves of kings? The legends of Edward II, his loves, his losses, his end, endure because they are ours. We see our own battles in his defiance, our own wounds in his betrayals. History may never know the truth of that night in Berkeley Castle, yet, in its mystery, we find a mirror for our own hearts. What would you sacrifice to be the person you were born to be?